And this kind of spontaneity, this kind of intuition, this kind of who knows what we're going to encounter is part of the receptive aspect. I'm not directing, I'm not deciding, I'm not logically thinking, what does the market care about? Let's talk about that. I'm just going to be trusting that the page that I flip to is going to be significant and aligned with what's most needed by at least one person out there. Hi, and welcome to my channel. My name is Tina Berger, and I am the author of Coming Around, Surprises and Surrender on the Path to Inspiration. It's my first book. And since this book was released in March, I've been having some really amazing conversations, been on some good podcasts, and I've had some input from friends and other readers of the book who have said, hey, you should actually consider doing some other types of media, because not everybody likes to sit down with a book and read. So it's been suggested that I do an audiobook, which is on my list of things for 2022. But also in the meantime, I thought might as well maybe put something like this together, a little clip or two on YouTube and see how people like this. So I'm really interested in your feedback on this approach, and we'll see how it goes. I am going to do this in a way that is a little unorthodox, I suppose, because when I first started thinking about doing a clip like this, I thought, well, I'll start at the beginning and kind of go to the ending, or I'd go to my favorite sections or whatever. But I think I'm going to do it very randomly, because that is one of the things that the journey to reclaim my receptive aspect has taught me. As part of our cultural programming, certain aspects of ourselves, certain ways of being and ways of expressing are emphasized and rewarded and paid for and given A's for, and other aspects of our personality, our kind of natural ways of being, are ignored or punished even. And the parts of ourselves, when I started digging into it, that I began to realize were being ignored and forgotten are the receptive aspects of our personalities. And for me, that was significant, because the receptive aspects are about our ability to really fully take in another human being, to really be in deep listening with what's being expressed, and actually even with the world at large. Are we really listening and attending to the inputs and what they mean? Are we really taking in the fullness of the person who's telling us a story, or who is emotionally hurting that we're sitting with? Or are we really just intellectually listening to the words that they say and finding fault with them, for example? I'm not going to go into a lot more detail about that right now. I think it's more fun for me to just flip to a page here. And this kind of spontaneity, this kind of intuition, this kind of who knows what we're going to encounter is part of the receptive aspect. I'm not directing, I'm not deciding, I'm not logically thinking, what does the market care about? Let's talk about that. I'm just going to be trusting that the page that I flip to is going to be significant and aligned with what's most needed by at least one person out there. All right, here we go. Well, funny enough, I've gone to the page that the first thing I read on it, it's page 141, is practice deep listening. And through this book, I have both stories and reflections, and also a few suggested activities to do to recultivate, remember, and reconnect with certain receptive qualities. And listening is a receptive activity. It's a receptive quality. And deep listening requires that we really listen beyond the words of a person. And we really take in the wholeness of that person. And we're listening with our whole being, and we're taking in the whole beingness of the person who's in conversation with us. And that requires a different level of attention, a different level of presence, and a kind of openness to take in emotionally and and with a lot of care and compassion, wherever that person is and whoever that person is and all that they're telling you and all that they're communicating in the ways that they communicate. There's some very small percentage of communication that's verbal, and that tends to be the part that we're focused on. I think it's like 97% of communication that is nonverbal, something like that. It's in the 90s. So this thing says, this is the activity that's suggested in this little blurb. Practice deep listening. Invite an acquaintance who has lived a very different experience from you to coffee or dinner. Explain that your intention is just to ask questions and to more fully understand his or her perspective. Prepare a few questions ahead of time in case you need them, but also allow yourself to be intensely curious and see what follow-up questions emerge naturally. Allow the conversation to progress organically as much as possible. Ask for stories to deepen your understanding. Occasionally mirror back what you have heard to ensure your understanding is accurate. Specifically listen for emotional connections and notice any reactions you experience in response. Allow silence for reflection and processing as needed. Resist any urge or prompting to share your own perspective or realizations. One of the biggest lessons that I had to learn on my journey was how to shut up and really listen. You know, I never got any real instruction, any help, any guidance or guidelines on how to do deep listening until I was in my later 30s. And I was taking classes at Naropa University in Boulder, Colorado. And I was taking classes in transpersonal and eco-psychology. And we got teachings in a practice called the way of counsel. And the way of counsel is really, it's a pan-cultural, very ancient approach to community communication and mindful communication in a circle of people. And the way that it goes is there are very few guidelines, just like with any individual meditative process. We weren't given any guidelines except for a very few that were actually quite difficult to do. So the first instruction is to speak from the heart. So that sounds easy enough. You speak from your emotional center. Well, for those of us who grew up in a culture and actually were quite successful in it, that tells you that your feelings in your emotional life is not really what's important, and actually it's a weakness if you succumb to or pay too much attention to what's happening in your emotions. Many of us learn to disassociate. And so speaking from the heart was something I really had to actually spend a lot of time and effort learning how to do. No one speaks over anyone. Typically this is done, it can be done without it, but typically this is done with some sort of an indication, some sort of a talking piece, or some sort of a way of indicating when you are complete with what it is you have to say. And then the next person can speak. And in the meantime, there is no talking over that person, there's no interrupting, there's no asking questions for clarification or any other reason. You're just in deep listening, okay? So counsel practice, speak from the heart, listen from the heart. And the instruction around that is, again, it's a practice. It takes time before you learn what it means to really listen from the heart, where you're taking in the whole person. You're not parsing their words. You're not listening so that you can come up with a pithy response or an interesting intellectual debate. You're really taking in that person. You're taking in their perspective. You're feeling them as they speak. You're listening behind the words, and you're taking in the person's entire being while they speak. And you're fully present with them and holding space with them. Then the next guideline is be spontaneous. Speak spontaneously. So when it's your turn to speak, either because you've been handed the talking piece or because you've picked it up and it is now your turn, you begin speaking without necessarily knowing what it is you're going to say. And the way that relates to deep listening is that If you knew what you were going to say, it means that you weren't fully present with the person who was speaking before you, because you were rehearsing, or you were imagining a response, or you were crafting what it is you were going to say when it became your turn. So speak spontaneously is a reminder to you to be present with the person who is speaking before you, and also not to be trying to position whatever it is that's coming through you. So this is another way of remaining connected to what's happening in your heart in this very present moment. So it keeps you present with what you're saying. And then the last main guideline is to be lean of expression. So typically counsel practices happen in a circle with a number of people. Could be 12, could be less, could be 2 people, doesn't matter. But the guideline is to be lean of expression, which means recognize that there are other people who have things to say that are very valuable. It doesn't mean don't say what you have to say. It doesn't mean cut off what you have to say or rush it. It means when you're complete with it, don't repeat it. Don't elaborate where no elaboration is necessary. Say what you have to say and yield the floor to the next person so that everyone has the opportunity to be heard in their fullness. There's a couple of additional pieces that I personally have found very useful in the teachings on counsel that I have received. One is refrain from interrupting or comforting people who are having an emotional experience. For example, let's imagine in the midst of telling a story or relating a powerful experience, a person who's speaking becomes emotional and begins to cry. Sometimes the reaction we want to have is to comfort that person, to reach out and touch them. And in this practice, we don't. We just allow the person to express what they have to express. We indicate that we're listening. We remain with them. But sometimes the act of comforting someone can be more for us than it is for them. Or even if it's not, it can feel like it is to the person who's speaking and having the emotional reaction. They can feel like in order to take care of you, because you seem uncomfortable, that they have to then close off to that emotional response. And the last little piece that I'll share is that anything that happens within a counsel circle is confidential unless there is alignment and agreement on what specifically can be shared out from it. So this is one of the most powerful teachings that I've ever had in my, now 57 years of life. And I've had the opportunity to practice this, and I also find that it helps me in my daily life. Just like yoga, practicing yoga or practicing some other mindfulness practice can translate to benefits and more mindful living off the mat. The same thing is true about counsel practice. I'm a much better consultant in my work. I'm a better listener as a family member. I'm a better listener as a friend. I'm a more compassionate person since I have learned this. And also I end up being in deep space with people a lot more, which is a beautiful thing. So I highly recommend that you give it a shot. Counsel practice is a pan-cultural practice. It's one of those things that has shown up around the world in different cultures with very slight variations. And no one really understands how these things end up being like that. But, it's a universal practice in that way. So no one really owns it. But there is a book that was written by Gigi Coyle, Virginia Coyle, and by Jack Zimmerman called The Way of Counsel, which I highly recommend as a resource book. And with that, I will say thank you so much for joining me. If you are enjoying this, please give me a comment, or of course you are always welcome to and invited to subscribe. In any case, I send you off with all my best wishes and the blessings of my grandmothers and my grandfathers who walk with me.